experience. I will provide an overview of the publishing process, focusing on how to prepare a manuscript in the publishing ethics and the peer review process. As said, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box. We'll try and check this periodically throughout the talk. Otherwise, you may ask questions at the end. Also, please let me know if I'm speaking too quickly or if you don't understand something. Again, write it in the chat box so we're sure to see it. Right, so before we start, I thought I would provide an overview of the publishing landscape today. There are approximately 10,000 publishers today, with 5,000 indexed in Scopus. Publishers are publishing around 33,000 active English language peer-reviewed journals, and there's a further 9,400 non-English language peer-reviewed journals being published. This number traditionally has grown by about 3.5% year on year. Now, these journals are publishing over 3 million articles per year, a number that traditionally grows by about 3% year on year. However, the growth rates have accelerated in recent years. So now we're seeing a growth rate of about 5% in terms of journals and 4% in terms of articles year on year. And this is due to an increase in research and development spend globally. Most governments are investing more into research and universities. And this investment is supporting the work of between 7 to 8 million researchers, depending on the definition of researchers. So it might mean people at universities or people in the private sector. Interestingly, only 20% are repeat authors. So as you can see, this is a very crowded landscape, and it's important that your work stands out, both in terms of the quality of research and the accessibility of the communication. To begin, here's a snapshot of the publishing process. We'll discuss each of these stages in detail, but what I would like to point out on this slide here are the different versions of the article. It's important to understand the significance of each of these versions, especially if you're not publishing in an open access manner. So the first version, this is called the author's original version or the preprint. This version you can submit for review, is a version you submit for review. Authors may post this version anywhere. The next version is called the accepted manuscript or the postprint. This version has gone through the peer review process and has been accepted. However, it hasn't been copy edited or typeset. Authors are able to post this version immediately on a personal website or share it via Facebook or LinkedIn. If the article is published in a subscription-based journal, the author must wait until after an embargo period to archive the article in a repository. If the journal is an open access journal, authors may post this version immediately. Lastly, we have the version of record. This is the final published version of the article. This version is maintained by the publisher and updated with relevant information. This version may not be posted on other sites unless you have published open access, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the presentation. Right, so before you begin investigating possible journal options, it's essential that you spend time understanding your project and the audience you would like to reach. Throughout your career, you will likely be involved in many types of research, producing a variety of content. Typically, people focus on the research article, but you may publish review articles, whether that's a literature or theory review or a systematic review, position pieces, case studies, book reviews. Sometimes your work will be written for specialists in your field, but you may also choose to engage in public scholarship, writing for the general public or policymakers. So take the time to determine your objectives with the current piece of work you're engaged with. When you begin investigating the appropriate place to publish, remember you're joining an ongoing conversation in your field and make sure that you're contributing thoughtfully to that conversation. There are many different elements to take into consideration when choosing a journal, and I've listed a few here. So first, age. Well-established journals with good reputations are a safe bet. However, that doesn't mean you should ignore new or recently established journals. They may be publishing cutting-edge research, they may be engaged in different publishing styles, but just make sure that you do your research on the journal to make sure it's a legitimate journal, and I'll cover a little bit more on that later. It can be helpful to look at the history of the journal. Does it publish on time? Do they have a history of retractions or other problems? Affiliation may be important. Is it the journal of an important society or publisher? In terms of scope, you might be interested in publishing interdisciplinary work. The journal might be a niche journal, just focusing on a very specific area. All this will be outlined in the aims and scope statement. Size, how many issues does it publish a year? That might be of interest to you. In terms of audience, it's important that you understand who is reading the journal. Is it practitioners? Is it a global audience? And impact, we talk about impact a lot, and it can be measured in a number of ways. So people often talk about impact factor, but it might be that it's essential that it's a journal that maybe has a low impact factor, but it's important to the academic community. It might be a source for teaching, etc. There's a lot of different ways of measuring it. The editorial board will give you an indication of what type of research they're interested in receiving. Boards are built to reflect the ambitions of the journal, so make sure to take time to look at that. And the publishing model, which again we'll be talking about a little bit later, is becoming increasingly important, especially in terms of funding. Peer review style may be important to you. I'll go over the different peer review styles a little bit later, but this information again should be easily accessible in the aims and scope statement or in the instructions for authors. And rejection rate, many journals do post the rejection rate on the website, and this will give you an indication of how competitive the journal is. Now, if the journal doesn't actually post the rejection rate, you can glean how competitive the journal is by looking at some of these other factors that I've outlined here. So impact factor, how often it publishes, and that sort of thing. You just have to do a little detective work. So in the last slide, I mentioned the aims and scope statement. All journals will have this, irrespective of the publisher. It's a statement of what the journal seeks to publish and who its main audience is, so who reads it. Editorial boards spend weeks crafting their aims and scope statements. Their goal is to clearly explain what they're trying to achieve with the journal and the type of research they're interested in publishing. The aims and scope statement will often include key information about the peer review policy, as I mentioned before. Now, the process of submitting a paper and waiting to hear if the editorial board is interested in publishing it can be rather long. And increasingly, editors are having to reject papers without sending them out to peer review because they're just inappropriate for the journal. They don't fit the scope. So save your time and the editorial board's time and energy by carefully reading the aims and scope statement before submitting your article for consideration. And if you're unsure, you can try sending an abstract of your paper to the journal editor to see if they would be interested. Now, not all editors are going to be able to answer these queries, especially if it's a really popular journal, but it's always worth a try if you're unsure. As mentioned, the decision of where to publish is often influenced by what publishing model the journal uses. And increasingly, open access is becoming a requirement for funders and institutions, especially in parts of Europe. And many feel that it is a sensible path forward. Here are the two basic elements of open access. The first is making content freely available. And the second is making content reusable in different ways. I'll briefly explain both of these elements. So you remember those versions of the paper I mentioned earlier. Here's where we see their importance. So green OA essentially involves the deposit of the accepted version of the paper that has not been sent to production into an institutional repository. So your university may have an institutional repository where they're trying to collect all the research that's been produced in the university. Often this occurs after an embargo period, because often these articles have been published in a subscription-based journal. And typically the embargo periods for arts and humanities and social sciences are a little bit longer, around 18 months for Taylor and Francis, than those in science and technology, which is about 12 months for us. And then for medicine, oftentimes that's a 6-month embargo period. So that's for green open access, one way of making your work freely available. The second way to make your work freely available is publishing gold open access. And gold open access essentially entails making the PDF freely available. It may involve an APC, which is an article publishing charge, which is usually paid by the funder or an institution. However, there are many journals that are supported by societies and either do not charge an APC or they may charge a lower subsidized APC. Also, most journals have a partial or full waiver for authors based in low to lower middle income countries. And all of this should be very clearly presented on the journal website under the instructions for authors. So this should not come as a surprise to you later in the process. And the second element of open access is how your work can be used after publication by others. So if you publish open access, you'll be asked to choose a Creative Commons license, which describes how people can use your work in the future. Some journals do not give you a choice on which type of license you can use, so it's important that you investigate prior to submission if you have any concerns. Here are some of the typical licenses you'll run into. So the first one is called CC BY. This license allows authors to use your work in any way they choose, as long as they clearly attribute the authorship and original publication. And this tends to be the default license that you'll find on most sites. The next one is CC BY NC. And here an author can use your work in any manner, but they cannot profit from it. For instance, they can't include your article in a book that they will charge money for in the future. And lastly, we've got the CC BY ND. Here the author cannot change your work in any way. They must use it in the original form. For instance, this would mean that they could not translate your work. Now you can also combine the CC BY NCND. That's the most restrictive license, so that means no one can profit from it and no one can change your work. The last one I've included here is CC BY SA, and that means that when people use your work, they need to attach the same license, so they can't change the license in the further publication. It's not as common, but you should be aware of it when using other people's work. Right. So with the rise of open access, we've seen an emergence of what are often called predatory publishers or journals. I can imagine that some of you have been contacted by these publishers who show interest in your work and ask you to submit to the journal. They often state that the peer review process is unrealistically short, so days rather than weeks. The websites might feature information that is incorrect or misleading, such as stating they have a global impact factor. Be aware, impact factors are called just that. There's never any kind of change in the name. It's just an impact factor. And here's some of the key characteristics of predatory journals. There's always hidden or unclear author fees. That's why I said everything should be really clearly detailed on the website about how much an author might be expected to pay for publication. There's a lack of quality peer review of articles by experts in the field. And there's usually a guarantee of acceptance and or the promise of very fast publication times, so within a week or 48 hours. If you want your research to be read and respected by others in your field, locally and internationally, it's important to avoid publication in these fake journals. En masse, they erode the credibility of all the research published in them. However, there are resources to help you make sound decisions about where you would like to publish. For instance, a key resource is called Think, Check, Submit, here on the left side of the slide. This is a cross-industry initiative which is aimed to help researchers make informed choices and to choose trusted journals to publish their research in. So Think, Check, Submit can help you identify high-quality journals which would be appropriate for submitting your research and can protect you against fraud and publishing malpractice. The best approach, though, at the end of the day, is to seek advice from respected colleagues. Another resource is the DOAJ. This is a database for open access journals. The journals in this database have been screened to ensure that they are legitimate. However, like many databases, there is an assessment process, so new journals that are legitimate might not be listed immediately. In those cases, you'll need to make sure that they're published by a respected publisher. And here is where OASPA can help. This is the last resource on this page. OASPA is an organization for publishers and service providers working with open access. Members need to meet certain standards to be included. If the journal you're considering publishing is not included in the DOAJ and or their publisher is not a member of OASPA, you should proceed with extreme caution. All right, so today obviously we're not going to be doing a writing workshop. I think it would be rather difficult with this many people, but I do have some simple tips for you to consider while preparing your manuscript. First of all, think like an editor. Make it easy for them to read and enjoy your work. Depending on the size of the journal, editors can receive anywhere from 50 to well over 1,000 manuscripts a year. Make sure yours stands out. Make sure to have people read your work before you submit it. Get as much feedback as possible during the writing process. And you might consider setting up a regular meeting of researchers and interdisciplinary people at different stages of their career. For example, when I was in grad school, we had a monthly kind of lunch where a bunch of people would meet, and it was professors down to PhD students, and every month we would talk about one paper and give feedback on it. And it was really, really helpful, both in terms of getting very diverse feedback on your work, but also to demystify the process, to understand that everybody struggles through the writing process. And what I would say is, if appropriate, have people in other disciplines or at least outside of your area, read your work to make sure that it translates, that it's easy to understand. Here's some basics to help making your argument easy to read and understand. The first one is write first and edit later. This will help you create a through line in your paper that holds all of the different parts together. And remember, simplicity is key, especially when you're dealing with complex problems and theories. Sentence structure can make a huge difference. Consider keeping your sentences relatively short. I've always worked with a 2.5 rule. So that means that no sentence should be longer than 2.5 lines because the reader tends to lose track after that point. Now, obviously, if in your sentence you're listing a number of items, perhaps you need to have a sentence that's going to be a bit longer than 2.5 lines. But in that case, I would say make sure to put those lists in parentheses. Again, just making it easier for the reader. Try to avoid or limit the use of passive voice in your sentence construction. Passive sentence construction is when the subject of the sentence is not clear. Now, this isn't always possible, such as in method sections. You wouldn't write, I conduct a study. Rather, you would typically write, a study was conducted. The main point here is if you are using passive sentence construction, just make sure to mix it up a bit to make it easier for the reader to follow your text. Paragraphs should include their own mini thesis, i.e. what's being covered, or relate directly to what has come before. Keep them focused on one idea. So if you are continuing a discussion introduced in the previous paragraph, make sure to indicate that in some way. For example, a section might be making numerous points with each paragraph addressing one of those points. It's just that you're indicating that with the first line of the new paragraph. Create a clear and easy to follow structure to your paper. Irrespective of discipline, most academic papers are going to follow this model. And I want to focus particularly on the first part here, rejection. As I said, most editors are receiving a lot of papers, and they often just kind of look at the first 3 pages to see what the paper is about, to see if it's appropriate. So it's important that you spend a lot of time and really focus on articulating what the question and problem is, and making sure that your thesis, your argument, is prominent there. Don't hide that argument. Make sure it stands out so people understand what you're engaged with. And then lastly, make sure that you create a roadmap so that the reader understands what is about to happen in that paper. So kind of outline what those sections are and then summarizing your argument in the end again. So these are just some basic tips here. And lastly, your role is that of a storyteller. It's up to you to give life to the exciting story of your research. So be brave and be bold in your storytelling. However, your story should follow a logical path, not necessarily chronological path. So do take time working with it. And I do think that if you start with that, writing first and editing your paper later, it helps with that process. Once you've published, you of course would like people to be able to find and read your work. This begins with the basics, the first elements of your article that potential readers will see, the title and the abstract. Here we have a fairly non-controversial quote from one of our editors. Title styles and formats can vary somewhat depending on subject area or individual writing style. However, here are some basic tricks to keep in mind when composing your title. First of all, write the title after you've written your paper. Although I don't think it's a bad idea to kind of have another piece of paper to the side where you're jotting ideas down as you're writing. Include some of the essential terms in your paper. You want to make sure to keep it short and to the point. So in doing some research on Google Scholar and giving tips on how to write titles and abstracts for that, they say for the titles it should be 16 words or fewer in a title. Avoid any jargon or abbreviations. Never include a period at the end of your title. Your title is not a sentence. And for those of you using qualitative methods, where the temptation is to use a quote in the title or something like that, make sure to provide context in the title as well. So you can have a quote, at the beginning, but then under with the subtitle, put the context in there so people understand what the article is about. Right, so why are abstracts important? I actually really appreciate this very frank quote from one of our editors. An abstract should tell the reader what the article is about. They're like mini film trailers. It should give a sense of what the story is about without providing all the details. So I always say they should be like French film trailers rather than American film trailers where you never have to go to the movie because they've already shown you everything in the trailer. And here's just a few basic tips. It's obviously difficult to write a decent abstract before you actually finish the paper, as the abstract is an overview of the content. Make sure you know the parameters of the particular journal you're submitting to. Most have word counts and perhaps guidance on the format and structure. So take a moment to look at those instructions for authors. And think about who your potential audience is, or your ideal audience is, and write for them. So you might use different language if you're writing for practitioners than if you're writing for people that are really deeply involved in that research area. And choose the language carefully. Think about the keywords and how someone might search for your work. Think interdisciplinary in terms of language as well. So consider how other people outside of your discipline might search for your research. Remove any unnecessary words and focus on the essential information. And remember, if you revise your paper, which you will during the peer review process, make sure to revise your abstract as well so it reflects that final paper. And lastly, read it out loud and have others read it for fluency. If your abstract is difficult to read, it's unlikely that people will click through and read your article. So you should spend just as much time on language with your abstract as you would on paper. Along with the titles and abstracts, authors are often asked to provide keywords that will be included with the metadata for the article. These act as flags and searches to help readers find your work. Make sure to identify the words and phrases that would be effective in searching for your work. So, and consider using synonyms, as people might use slightly different words than you would, especially if your work is interdisciplinary, as I mentioned. When using words and phrases, be specific to narrow down the search results. So think about using qualifiers, as I have here with this example of homelessness versus Swedish homelessness policy. You know, with those qualifiers, you're probably going to get much more specific results, whether it's white papers or policy papers or actual research papers. And then lastly, test your words in Google. What results do you get? If it's not what you would expect, think about refining them. Right, so I've mentioned the instructions for authors a few times, and essentially this is the journal rule book. So you want to read through them thoroughly and make sure that you follow the requirements of the journal and you understand what those requirements are. Again, this is where you're going to have information about peer review. You're going to have information about any author charges, so whether that's submission fees or if it's an open access journal, the APCs that they might charge. It will have information on word limits, formatting requirements, copyright, etc. Your paper must adopt all of these requirements. Otherwise, it's likely to be returned to you for reformatting rather than being sent out to peer review. Okay, so issues around publishing ethics are seemingly on the rise, or possibly we're just getting much better at identifying breaches. Here are some of the issues that we see on a regular basis. So we have authorship, competing interests, duplicate submissions or publications, data or image fabrication or falsification, plagiarism or text recycling, peer review manipulation, and breaches of copyright. We could easily have a full session today on publishing ethics, but I will just focus on three of the most common issues we tend to deal with. So that's authorship and duplicate submission and plagiarism text recycling. So authorship issues are quite common and tend to slow down the peer review process and peer review and production process. Often these issues have to do with disagreements over who is included on the author line, the sequence of names, and who's responsible for different parts of the process. It is extremely important that you have a written agreement between all the authors regarding responsibilities and the sequence of names on the authorship line before you submit your paper. These are three distinct issues that we see oftentimes. So ghost authorship means a significant contribution to a manuscript has been made without acknowledgement of that contribution. This is an issue because we can't know if there is a conflict of interest. So the example would be, there's some examples that we have from industry. Many of you might have heard about the tobacco industry in the 60s. You know, there was a lot of papers published, and actually it was people from industry writing the papers, but academic names were assigned to the authorship line. So there was no understanding that there was a conflict of interest there. The next one is guest authorship, and this is when authorship is granted to an individual who does not meet the ethical standards of authorship because of his or her seniority, reputation, or supposed influence. Now, this is common in some institutions, but anyone on the authorship line should have made a significant contribution to the paper, as they'll be held responsible for it in the future. And the last one is a phenomena that has arisen in the last few years, and this is authorship for sale. So there have been a number of cases where predatory publishers or paper mills offer to add an author's name after the paper has been accepted for publication for a significant price. So here I've identified, you know, some of the basic categories of who, characteristics of who qualifies as an author. But the main takeaway point here is any listed author is a representative of the published paper and should have in-depth knowledge about all aspects of the study as published, the rationale, the methodology, analysis, and interpretation, etc. So duplicate submission is also an issue that we deal with quite regularly. And this is a rule that many early career researchers are surprised by. So why is it a problem? The basic rule is one journal at one time. So you submit your manuscript only to one journal at one time. And the problem of submitting to more than one journal at a time is when you submit a paper to a journal for review, you are committing to publish in that journal. And they will use their time and the resources to review your paper and help you improve it. You can only publish a paper once. There can only be one version of record. Now, the issue here is it's relatively easy to detect. Often the papers are sent to the same reviewers who then alert the editors and publishers, and we all come together and deal with the situation. Now, this can often happen because there wasn't a clear agreement on rules and responsibilities between the authors. So hence two of the co-authors could accidentally submit their paper to two different journals. But the problem is editors are becoming less forgiving and will withdraw the paper in question from peer review if it has been a case of duplicate submission. So you really, really do need to avoid this at all costs. Now, sometimes it's okay to submit work that has been presented elsewhere. You just need to be honest with the editor about previous presentation, publication, or posting. Transparency is key. For instance, if you publish an article in another language but would like to publish in English, contact the editor of the journal you would like to publish in and ask them if they would be interested in publishing a translation. They may be happy to do so, or they may suggest another journal to you. Similarly, with data presented at conferences, it's not unusual to publish an article based on content presented at a conference. Just make sure you clearly state that the data or the earlier version of the paper was presented at a conference. Preprint servers are no longer an issue for most journals. Again, though, it's important that you cite the original publication of your paper and let the editor know that an earlier version can be found in the archive repository or a preprint server, and provide the link to that so they can take a look at it. And originality issues are also becoming easier to detect. Most journals use software to measure instances of overlap with previously published work. Most of you know that if you use someone else's ideas, processes, or words, you need to clearly cite them in the paper and provide full reference to the work. This is true of all content, including websites and blogs and such. What many are less aware of is the need to cite their own published work if you've used it in your paper, because this will obviously show up in any kind of originality check. However, on the flip side of that, we are seeing a rise of text recycling, oftentimes called salami slicing. This is when you use the same ideas, data, or words excessively to the point that it's not offering any new insights or contributing anything new to the literature or the field. Anything you publish should be original content and pushing the research field forward. Right, so before you submit, here are a few things to consider. First thing is, it's a good idea to review what has already been published in the journal that you're planning on submitting to. You may find work that is relevant to your own. And if you do, it's important that you reference previously published articles if it's relevant. You don't want to cite articles that aren't relevant. Many of our editors are actually surprised when they receive a manuscript dealing with a subject matter that they have been extensively covering in the journal for years, yet the author doesn't refer to any of it. So again, remember, you're joining a conversation. You want to make sure to be engaging in that conversation. Make sure that your work matches the aims and scope of the journal. Again, review your bibliography before submitting and make sure you've included everything and removed references that are no longer in the current draft. And again, just to stress, make sure to read and follow those instructions for authors. I suggest that you format your paper in the style of the journal as you write. The last thing you want to do is reformat the paper after countless hours of you've spent writing it and revising it. we are seeing a rise of format-free submissions, but in the case that your journal doesn't have that, you might format as you go along. And just a quick word about language. I get this question a lot, irrespective of where I am in the world. Most editors are happy to look at a paper as long as they can understand the argument and methods. The language does not have to be perfect. However, try to have a native English speaker read your paper for fluency. But remember, not all native English speakers are equal. Some may have a better understanding of grammatical conventions and broader vocabulary, or an understanding of the particular language used in your subject area. But basically, the advice here is that if people can understand what your argument is and follow it, it's okay to submit your paper, and then wait to hear back from the editors and reviewers. They'll let you know if the paper needs further language editing. Now, if you feel like you do need language editing before you submit, many publishers like Taylor and Francis do have editing services, and the information will be present on the website. Right, so getting ready to submit. Here's some basic tips to keep in mind prior to submitting your article. First of all, in most cases, you will be submitting to an online system, so make sure that you have all the files on hand that you need to submit. If you're using images or data that's not yours, it's up to you to obtain permission, not the publisher. So make sure that you have all those permissions before you submit. It's your responsibility. As I mentioned before, make sure you have an agreed upon plan with your co-authors and that you have their correct information, including their preferred spelling of their name. And lastly, make sure the version you submit is the final version and not an earlier draft. I know that sounds funny, but this does happen now and again where people submit an earlier draft to the paper and they wait 3 months and then it's rejected and they see their paper and go, oh no, this was the December version. So do take the time to make sure all those files are the most recent and up-to-date files. Right. So this is everyone's favorite part of the process, the peer review process. And this is just a little overview of how peer review works in most cases. Your manuscript is submitted to the journal and goes through a check initially to see if everything is in order. So again, they're going to be thinking about those instructions for authors and making sure that it's formatted correctly and that sort of thing. If it's not formatted correctly or missing files and or other components, it will be returned to you with instructions to reformat, update, or include more material. Once the files are in order, the submission is sent to the editor for a quick review. Again, the editor will decide if the paper should be sent out to peer review, usually by reading those first 3 pages or so to see if it is relevant. At this stage, it can be rejected if it's out of scope for the journal or not complete, or maybe it's not understandable. This is called a desk reject. So you see that little red box there. Now, if the paper is of interest, the editor will send it out for peer review, usually to 2 or more external reviewers who are specialists in the field. They'll read the work and provide a report for the editor with recommendations for a decision. The most common recommendations are revise and resubmit at this stage, and that might be with major or minor revisions. This means that they're interested in your work, so this is a win if you get this type of a decision, but they just want you to improve it, so they have suggestions on how you can make it even better. Your paper can also be rejected at this point, of course. Now, I've included except here with a little star. It is possible that your paper will be accepted without revisions. However, it is highly unlikely. And here I usually tell the story of Eugene Fama, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago. And I went to his lecture series and I couldn't follow anything because it was really advanced math. But at one point, he's presenting the paper that led him to win the Nobel Prize. And he steps back and he looks at his paper and says, you know, that's the only paper that was accepted without revisions. So here's a man presenting the paper that led him to win the Nobel Prize. He was in his 70s, and it's the only paper that was accepted without revisions. So again, this is just a part of the process. Don't be surprised when your work isn't accepted without revisions, because every piece of writing can be improved upon. Now, once you make those revisions, you'll resubmit to the editor, who will either accept it or send it out to review, send it out again to the reviewers to see if they're happy with the comments. Now, here's the bad news. Your paper can go through this process a couple times and still be rejected. I'll tell you how to avoid that in just a moment. Now, here are the 3 types of peer review. I should note, with open science and open research movement, we're seeing even more innovations on how peer review is organized. But here are the 3 typical ones you'll run into. Single blind peer review is when the identity of the peer reviewer is hidden. And double blind is where both identities are hidden. And lastly, open research is where all the identities are known. So it's pretty straightforward there. And again, this information will be available on the journal website. Now, I mentioned your paper can go through the peer review cycle a couple of times and still be rejected. And here are some tips on how you can avoid that outcome. First of all, when you do get that, when you do get the report back, and especially if it's major revisions, it can feel a little bit like a rejection, but don't become disheartened. This is just, again, part of the process. Take time to carefully read the decision letter that the editor will have likely sent. It might give you some instructions on how to deal with the reviewer's comments. It will likely give you a timeline that they're looking to receive the new version of the paper and that sort of thing. So take time to read that. And once you are ready to get to work, set up a meeting with your co-authors and take the time to break down those comments that have been given by the reviewers. And think about breaking them down by category and creating a to-do list. And as you go through that to-do list, you will probably make some choices about which amendments are appropriate and which might not be appropriate. So make all the suggested amendments that are appropriate. And remember, if the peer reviewer misunderstood something, it might actually be your fault. It might have been that you weren't able to explain it as clearly as you could. That's why it's really helpful to have people outside of your research circle read your work. So try rewriting that section again and having other people read it to make sure that they can understand the point you're trying to make. And in terms of avoiding rejection after going around peer review a couple times, here's the key area to keep in mind. You need to address every comment that has been made by a reviewer, every suggestion. So if you are adopting those recommendations, be really clear where you made those changes. So the page number and what the new material was. If you decided that the recommendation wasn't appropriate, you need to be specific about about why you didn't make that change. And again, be respectful. They're just trying to help you. But if they're suggesting you rework some data or include some citations you don't think are appropriate, aren't relevant for your project, just clearly explain why. Before you send everything back, make sure to review the responses that the response a couple times to make sure that any frustration you have isn't present in your language. We want you to be professional and respectful of the reviewers and editors, because they're really trying to help you publish your very best work. And for reviewers, they're doing this oftentimes on their own time for free, Sunday afternoons. So make sure that that you show them respect for the work that they're doing to help you improve. Excuse me. Right. So in the instance that your paper was rejected, and it will happen in your career once or twice, here's a couple things to think about. First of all, close your computer, have a cup of tea, forget about your paper for a couple days. You can apply the same strategy as I mentioned in the previous slide. So make a list of the comments and begin editing the paper for a new submission, because oftentimes when the paper is rejected, you will get some comments about why it was rejected. However, it is, there is the chance that the rejection was due to the fact that you just sent it to the wrong journal. So you might want to take that into consideration. And again, when you're submitting your manuscript to a new journal, make sure to, adapt all the rules of that journal, so reformatting and that sort of thing. And here are the top reasons for rejection. So again, remember to carefully read the aims and scope of the journal and look at what's been published previously. And understand what sort of writing project you're undertaking and research the best platform for your work. The biggest challenge for many is turning a thesis or dissertation chapter into an article. It requires quite a bit of confidence and often painful editing. Let's see. Again, review and follow the instructions for authors. And you might think about workshopping your paper, i.e. having trusted colleagues read and comment. If possible, again, have a native English speaker take a look at your manuscript. If you choose an international journal, think about the examples or theoretical framework you use to make certain that they will be of interest to an international audience. And again, presenting your work at conferences can really help in this area so that you're getting some new insights into your work. And the last one, obviously, avoid at all costs. You're entering into a professional sphere, so you really do need to make sure that your work represents that. So what do you do when your article is accepted? Of course, you celebrate. You've earned it. While getting published is a great accomplishment, no matter what stage of your career, and it's especially true the first time. Make sure that you keep both the original manuscript you submitted and the accepted manuscript. Again, I talked about those different versions of the paper and what you can do with those there. Publishers try their best to move manuscripts through the production process as quickly as possible, but much depends on the authors. So be sure to return the proofs by the suggested deadline and answer any queries that the production editor might have as quickly as possible. And lastly, don't hesitate to ask questions. That's what we're all here for. So if something is confusing, just get in touch and we'll try and help out. And here are just some simple but effective ways of drawing attention to your work. The first one here is your email signature. You can easily use your email signature to tell everyone you've just been published. One of the editors I work with, he has his email signature with his, address and everything, and right under it, he just has recent publications and then has the hyperlinks to those publications. So something as simple as that is easy to do. If you have profile pages on your institutional website, a personal page, or sites for any projects you're involved with, please include a link to your article. The more links there are to your article from a range of websites, the higher it will appear on search engine results. It's also a good idea to point any of your students in the direction of your work. If you're on any networking sites or discussion lists, then do make the most out of those. Post a short message to any listservs that you're a member of, letting people know that the journal's latest issue, which includes your article, is now available. The easiest way to do this is to register for the table of contents alert for the journal so that you can forward the email once you've received it. And obviously, for those of you that are a blogger, or have personal websites or using social media actively, always write about your article and link to it. One of my friends from graduate school is really great on Facebook, where he'll say, for those of you interested, here's my most recent publication. So again, simple thing to do. And that's it from me. So I'm happy to take questions now, or if you'd like, you can contact me on the address on this slide here.